Die now be asterisk TCH. The words were spat with cruel confidence as the metal gate slammed shut, echoing through the concrete corridor. On the other side of the fence, growls rose low and hungry, the sound of an animal pushed past restraint. A starving military K9 paced the pen, muscles tight, teeth flashing in the dim light. The men watching laughed, convinced they had just delivered a lesson no one would forget. To them, this was hazing, a warning, a reminder of who held power. To her, it was something else entirely, a moment where everything she had trained for, everything she had endured, was about to be revealed. They thought they had thrown a helpless new recruit into a death trap. What they didn't know was that the woman they mocked was the dog's handler. Welcome back to Swifttail, where powerful stories unfold and hidden truths come to light. And if this is your first time visiting Swifttail, let me ask you a question. Do you enjoy stories that shock you at first, then leave you thinking long after they end? If so, would you like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale like this one? Here we don't just tell dramatic stories, we explore the lessons behind them, the moments where arrogance meets reality, and where underestimated people reveal who they truly are. Today's story is one of those moments. It begins with cruelty masked as tradition and arrogance disguised as authority. A group of elite operators believe they're untouchable, convinced that rank, reputation, and numbers give them the right to break someone new. The recruit at the center of it all is quiet, observant, and deliberately unremarkable. She doesn't boast. She doesn't argue. She doesn't react the way they expect. And in environments like this, silence is often mistaken for weakness. That assumption sets everything in motion. The setting is a restricted training compound, a place built for discipline and precision, but also a place where lines can blur when oversight disappears. Among the most feared areas of the compound is the K9 unit, where military dogs are trained for detection, protection, and combat operations. These animals are powerful, intelligent, and dangerous when mishandled. Rumors circulate about a particular dog kept in a separate pen, aggressive, unpredictable, half-starved due to a recent transition between handlers. The pen becomes a symbol of fear, a place no one wants to end up. And fear, when combined with cruelty, becomes a weapon. When the men decide to throw the new recruit into that pen, they believe they're proving a point. They believe they're in control. What they don't understand is that control doesn't come from volume or intimidation. It comes from knowledge, trust, and discipline. As the gate closes and the dog advances, seconds from what looks like certain disaster, the truth hangs just out of reach. The crowd expects screaming, panic, blood. What they get instead is something far more unsettling: calm. This story matters because it exposes a dangerous mindset, the belief that power gives permission to dehumanize. It reveals how easily expertise can be overlooked when it doesn't match stereotypes, and how quickly groupthink can turn into something lethal. It also highlights a bond few truly understand, the connection between a handler and a military working dog, built on trust, consistency, and respect. In a world that often rewards loud confidence over quiet competence, this story reminds us that the most capable people are often the least flashy. As this tale unfolds, you'll witness how arrogance collapses under the weight of truth, how cruelty backfires when directed at the wrong person, and how a situation designed to humiliate becomes a moment of reckoning. You'll see how a single command can change everything, how silence can hold more power than threats, and how respect, once lost, can never be fully reclaimed. So stay with me, watch how the pen that was meant to destroy her becomes the place where everything is revealed. Because by the end of this story, the question won't be whether she survives, but how the ones who laughed will live with what they've done once they realize who she really is. From the moment she arrived, it was clear she didn't fit the image they expected. The new recruit moved quietly through the compound, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, eyes forward, posture relaxed but precise. She didn't announce herself, she didn't try to impress anyone. In a place where dominance was often expressed through volume and bravado, her calm presence felt out of place, and that made her an immediate target. The others sized her up in seconds, deciding who she was before she ever spoke. Too quiet, too controlled, too different. And in an environment where conformity was mistaken for strength, difference was treated like weakness. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some were mocking, others openly hostile. A few men laughed about how long she would last. Someone joked that she'd be gone by the end of the week. Another said she didn't belong there at all. Hazing had long been justified as tradition, a so-called test of toughness, and newcomers were expected to endure it without complaint. But the attention she drew wasn't random, it was deliberate. Her refusal to react, to rise to the bait, only fueled their aggression. Silence to them felt like a challenge. She noticed everything, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the looks exchanged behind her back, the exaggerated toughness in voices meant to intimidate. She'd seen it before, in different forms, in different places. People often mistook restraint for fear and professionalism for submission. She let them. There was no advantage in correcting them, not yet. Experience had taught her that sometimes the safest place to stand was inside an assumption, waiting for the moment it collapsed under its own weight. What they didn't see was the discipline beneath her stillness. Every movement was economical, practiced. She woke early, trained methodically, followed procedures without cutting corners. She listened more than she spoke. When spoken to, she answered clearly and briefly, never defensive, never apologetic. That only irritated them more. They wanted excuses. They wanted anger. They wanted proof that she was rattled. She gave them none of it. To the men watching, she was an unknown variable, and unknowns made people uncomfortable. Rather than question their assumptions, they doubled down on them. Labels formed quickly, soft, clueless, dead weight. Each one made it easier to justify what came next. In their minds, she wasn't a person anymore. She was a problem to be corrected, a lesson to be taught. She sensed the shift before it happened. The glances grew sharper, the jokes darker. The tone changed from mockery to something more calculated. This wasn't just about hazing anymore, it was about control. About reminding the new recruit where she stood in the hierarchy. And somewhere along the line, a dangerous idea took hold, one that crossed from intimidation into outright cruelty. Still, she said nothing. Inside, she remained steady. She had endured far worse environments than this, places where mistakes were fatal and trust was everything. Compared to those, this compound felt loud, careless, and reckless, but she also understood that arrogance, when left unchecked, tends to escalate, and escalation was exactly what was coming. They believed they were about to break her. What they didn't know was that the woman they underestimated had been trained not just to survive pressure, but to remain in control when others lost it. And soon, their assumptions were going to place them face to face with a truth they never saw coming. The K-9 unit sat at the far edge of the compound, separated from the rest of the training grounds by layers of fencing and unspoken rules. Most recruits avoided the area altogether, not because it was off-limits, but because of what it represented. The dogs housed there were not pets. They were weapons, highly trained, highly intelligent, and capable of extreme violence when commanded or provoked. Everyone knew the stories. Dogs that had taken down armed targets. Dogs that didn't hesitate. Dogs that reacted faster than human reflexes could keep up with. And among those stories, one name was spoken more carefully than the rest. There was one pen in particular that carried a reputation darker than the others. The dog inside had recently been reassigned after handler rotation, a critical transition period that left even well-trained K-9s unsettled. The animal was powerful, alert, and aggressive toward anyone unfamiliar. Rumors exaggerated the truth, as rumors always do, claims that the dog hadn't eaten properly in days, that it had become unpredictable, that it had nearly attacked someone during maintenance. Whether all of it was true didn't matter. Fear feeds on uncertainty, and the uncertainty surrounding that pen was enough to keep people at a distance. To the men watching from outside the fence, the K-9 unit was a symbol of dominance. They spoke about it with bravado, half joking, half serious, as if proximity to danger somehow validated their toughness. They bragged about how they weren't afraid of the dogs, about how they could handle it if things went sideways. But none of them ever stepped inside those pens without authorization. None of them ever tested that confidence alone. Deep down, they understood the reality. Once the gate closed, there were no second chances. The dog inside the infamous pen paced restlessly, muscles shifting beneath its coat, nails scraping against concrete. Its senses were constantly working, tracking sound, scent, movement. Without its handler present, it relied purely on instinct and conditioning. To an untrained eye, it looked feral. To those who understood K9 behavior, it looked like an animal waiting for a familiar command that never came. The absence of that bond, the one thing that grounded it, made the situation volatile. This was why the idea took hold. Someone laughed and suggested it first, masking cruelty as humor. Another added to it, pushing the thought further. The logic twisted quickly. If she's really tough, she'll handle it. If she can't, she doesn't belong here anyway. The K9 pen became more than a threat. It became a tool, a shortcut, a way to assert control without leaving visible marks. They convinced themselves it was a test, that it would scare her, break her, force her to quit. In their minds, the danger was part of the lesson. What they didn't acknowledge was how far they had crossed the line, from hazing into something potentially fatal. Fear has a way of numbing empathy, especially when it's wrapped in group approval. As the plan solidified, the K9 unit loomed larger in everyone's thoughts. The fencing no longer looked like a safety measure, it looked like a barrier separating power from vulnerability. And at the center of it all was the dog, alert and waiting, unaware that it was about to become part of a cruelty born from arrogance and ignorance. What none of them understood, what made the situation so dangerously ironic, was that the K9 unit was not her weakness. It was her world. And the pen they feared was a place she knew better than any of them ever would. What began as muttered jokes hardened into a plan the moment they realized no one was going to stop them. The tone shifted, less laughter now, more certainty. Someone framed it as a test, a word that made the cruelty feel official, justified, even necessary. In their minds, this wasn't abuse, it was tradition, a rite of passage, a way to see who belonged and who didn't. The fact that the test involved real danger only seemed to excite them more, sharpening their sense of control. They closed in around her under the pretense of instruction. Orders were barked. She was told to follow, to move faster, to stop asking questions she never asked in the first place. She complied without protest, walking between them with the same measured calm she'd carried since arriving. The closer they got to the K9 unit, the louder the bravado became, as if the sound of their own voices could drown out the reality of what they were about to do. Someone cracked a joke about survival rates. Another smirked and said she'd learn respect the hard way. She noticed the details immediately, the way they positioned themselves, the way one man drifted toward the gate controls, the way the others spread out to block exits. This wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed, or at least rehearsed enough. A line had already been crossed, and there was no confusion about intent anymore. Still, she said nothing. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. Resistance would have escalated things faster than silence ever could. When they reached the pen, the dog inside reacted to the sudden cluster of bodies. Low growls rolled through the metal bars, vibrating through the concrete. The sound made a few of them hesitate, just for a fraction of a second. That hesitation passed quickly, buried under pressure to follow through. No one wanted to be the one who backed out. Group cruelty thrives on that exact weakness. "This is what happens when you don't listen," someone said, gripping her arm. Another reached for the gate. The metal latch rattled, loud in the tense air. She felt the shift in energy, the moment where intimidation turned into action. The smell of the pen hit her, sharp and familiar, carrying layers of animal, disinfectant, and stress. The dog's movements quickened, nails scraping harder now, body alert. The final words were meant to terrify her. They leaned in close, voices low and deliberate, confident that fear was about to do the work for them. The gates swung open. Hands shoved her forward. It wasn't violent in the cinematic sense, no dramatic struggle, but it was calculated, forceful, and utterly reckless. The kind of action taken by people who believed they would never face consequences. The gates slammed shut behind her with a metallic echo that rang louder than any insult. For a brief moment, everything froze. The men stepped back, hearts pounding, waiting for chaos. They expected screams, panic, proof that they'd been right about her all along. Inside the pen, she didn't run. She stood still, feet planted, shoulders relaxed, eyes focused, not on escape but on the dog. The growling continued, tense and warning, but her breathing remained slow and even. The trap they had built, meant to break her, had snapped shut. They thought the test was over. They had no idea it had only just begun. The air inside the pen felt heavier, thick with the sharp scent of animal musk, damp concrete, and old stress. Every sound seemed amplified, the scrape of claws against the ground, the rhythmic exhale of a powerful chest, the low growl vibrating straight through her bones. The dog circled once, slow and deliberate, eyes locked on her every movement. To anyone else, this would have been the moment panic took over, the moment instinct screamed to run, to shout, to pound on the gate. Outside the fence, the men leaned forward, anticipation tightening their faces, waiting for fear to finally surface. She didn't move. Her hands stayed loose at her sides, fingers relaxed, shoulders squared but not rigid. Her gaze remained steady, never challenging, never fearful. She knew what sudden movement would mean. She knew what tension would communicate. Dogs read bodies faster than words, and every inch of her posture spoke a language the men outside had never bothered to learn. Calm was not weakness here, it was survival. The growling deepened as the dog closed the distance, muscles bunching beneath its coat. Its ears twitched, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. Hunger, confusion, agitation, all of it churned beneath the surface. The animal had been primed for threat, conditioned to react decisively. One wrong signal, one spike of fear, and the situation would explode into violence faster than anyone could intervene. The men outside knew this. That was the point. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Training took over where instinct might have failed. She measured the dog's pace, its angle of approach, the tension in its tail. These weren't signs of a mindless attack, they were signs of uncertainty. The animal wasn't sure what she was yet, threat or not, familiar or foreign, that hesitation was everything. Outside the pen, the laughter died down. Silence crept in as seconds stretched longer than anyone expected. No scream, no sudden movement, no blood. A few of them exchanged confused glances, unease replacing confidence. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The dog should have lunged by now. She should have been begging, crying, banging on the gate. Inside, she lowered her center of gravity just slightly, not enough to crouch, not enough to signal submission, but enough to ground herself. Her breathing stayed slow and controlled, each inhale deliberate, each exhale steady. The dog paused, head tilting almost imperceptibly. The growls softened, shifting in tone, no longer pure aggression, but something closer to warning mixed with confusion. She felt the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. One sound, one word spoken too soon, could tip everything into chaos. The men outside still believed they were in control, still believed the danger was inevitable. They didn't understand that the most critical battle was already being fought, not with force, but with restraint. Time stretched, fragile and razor-thin. And then, just as the dog took another cautious step forward, she prepared to do the one thing no one on the other side of the fence expected. She was about to speak, not in fear, not in desperation, but with authority. And whatever happened next would change everything. Before the pen, before the laughter, before the gate ever closed, there had been years of discipline no one bothered to ask about. Her journey with canines didn't begin in this compound or under these men's watchful eyes. It began long before, in places where mistakes cost lives and trust was non-negotiable. As a handler, she had learned early that dogs didn't respond to volume or intimidation. They responded to consistency, clarity, and calm leadership. While others trained to overpower situations, she trained to read them. Her first assignment with a military working dog had been humbling. The animal was stronger, faster, and more perceptive than she was, and it tested her constantly. Every hesitation was noticed. Every emotional spike mirrored back. She learned to regulate herself before she ever tried to regulate the dog. Long hours were spent building routine, feeding, grooming, training drills repeated until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Over time, a bond formed that went beyond commands. The dog learned her scent, her cadence, the subtle changes in her breathing. She learned the dog's thresholds, its stress signals, the difference between aggression and uncertainty. Certification wasn't easy. It demanded precision under pressure, control in chaos, and accountability when things went wrong. She trained in controlled environments first, then in increasingly hostile ones, darkened structures, loud machinery, unpredictable distractions. Through it all, she learned a single truth that separated competent handlers from exceptional ones. A K9 reflects the handler's state of mind. Panic creates panic. Calm creates clarity. There were moments that tested her resolve. close calls during operations, split-second decisions where the dog looked to her not for reassurance, but for direction. She never raised her voice unless necessary. She never broke trust for convenience. When corrections were required, they were clear and immediate, never cruel. That balance earned her something rare in the K9 world: absolute loyalty. The dog didn't obey out of fear. It obeyed because it trusted her judgment more than its own instincts. Handler rotations were always the most dangerous periods. She had seen it before: dogs unsettled by change, struggling to recalibrate without their primary point of reference. It wasn't neglect that caused problems, it was disruption. That knowledge stayed with her. It shaped how she approached every new assignment, every transition. Dogs needed stability before they could offer protection. Without it, even the best-trained animal could become volatile. So when she stood inside that pen, facing a dog stripped of routine and familiarity, none of this felt foreign. The setting was wrong. The circumstances were reckless, but the animal itself, that she understood completely. She recognized the tension for what it was: not pure aggression, but confusion layered over conditioning. The dog wasn't looking for a target, it was looking for guidance. Outside the pen, the men believed they had orchestrated a moment of terror. Inside, she was standing in familiar territory, one shaped by years of trust-building, discipline, and respect. And now, with the right command, she was about to remind the dog exactly who she was. Not a victim, not a recruit to be broken, but a handler who had never stopped being in control. The dog stopped packing. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The muscles that had been coiled for attack loosened just enough to signal hesitation. Its head lowered slightly, ears shifting forward, eyes still locked on her, but no longer burning with blind aggression. The growl faded into a low, uncertain rumble. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the narrow window where instinct paused and training could take over. She spoke. Not loudly, not in fear. Just one word, delivered with calm authority, shaped by years of repetition and precision. It wasn't a command anyone outside the pen recognized. It wasn't meant for them. It was meant for the dog, and the reaction was immediate. The animal froze, confusion flashing across its face as recognition began to replace agitation. Its breathing slowed. The tension in its stance shifted, weight redistributing as it processed what it had just heard. Outside the fence, the men stiffened. They hadn't expected sound, certainly not that sound. This wasn't screaming or pleading. It was controlled, deliberate, confident. The kind of voice used by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A few of them laughed nervously, assuming it wouldn't matter. They were wrong. She followed with a second command, just as precise, just as measured. The dog's tail lowered, its hackles flattened. The growl stopped entirely. In its place was silence, heavy, disorienting silence. The animal took a step back instead of forward, eyes never leaving her face. That single movement sent a ripple of unease through the crowd outside. This wasn't part of the plan. Dogs didn't do this with strangers. She adjusted her stance slightly, angling her body the way handlers are trained to, non-threatening but directive. Her hands remained visible, steady, no sudden movements. Then came the third command. This one carried familiarity, reinforced by repetition, burned deep into the dog's conditioning. The reaction was undeniable. The dog sat. The pen might as well have been empty for how silent it became. No laughter, no whispers, just stunned disbelief as the animal that was supposed to tear her apart now waited calmly at her feet, eyes alert but obedient. The men outside stared, minds scrambling for explanations that didn't exist. Some stepped closer to the fence, as if proximity might make sense of what they were seeing. She didn't look at them. Her attention stayed on the dog, her expression focused, her presence grounded. She rewarded the behavior with a subtle shift in tone, a quiet affirmation only the animal could fully appreciate. The bond snapped back into place like a lock finding its key. Confusion gave way to recognition. Recognition gave way to trust. In that moment, power shifted. The pen was no longer a weapon. The dog was no longer a threat. And the woman they had thrown inside was no longer underestimated. She was undeniable. They had expected fear. What they witnessed instead was control. And for the first time since this began, the men outside understood something was very, very wrong. The silence outside the pen broke in fragments, sharp breaths, muttered disbelief, the sound of boots shifting uneasily on concrete. What they were seeing made no sense within the story they had told themselves. The dog sat calmly, alert and obedient, its body language no longer aggressive but focused, waiting for direction. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was training. And that realization hit them all at once, heavy and unavoidable. She finally turned her head toward them, her expression unchanged. No anger, no triumph, just calm authority. "Open the gate," she said, her voice steady, professional. It wasn't a request, it was a directive. The words landed differently now, stripped of mockery and backed by proof they couldn't deny. For a moment, no one moved. The same men who had shoved her inside suddenly looked uncertain, their confidence drained away. One of them stammered something, an excuse, maybe a question, but it didn't matter. She issued another command to the dog, precise and familiar. The animal shifted position immediately, creating space near the gate, posture disciplined and controlled. That was when it became undeniable. No stranger could do that. No victim could do that. Only a handler could. Recognition spread like a shockwave. Someone whispered her name, suddenly remembering a file they hadn't bothered to read. Another man's face went pale as the pieces snapped together. The recent handler rotation, the unsettled dog, the missing detail that explained everything. This wasn't just any K9. This was her K9. The animal they had weaponized against her was bonded to the very person they tried to break. The gate finally opened. She stepped out calmly, the dog rising and falling into position at her side as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No hesitation, no confusion, just loyalty. The contrast was devastating. The pen that had been meant to humiliate her now framed her competence instead. The dog's obedience was a living indictment of their ignorance. Authority figures arrived quickly after that, drawn by the tension and the gathering crowd. Explanations were demanded, voices overlapped, but the scene spoke louder than any argument ever could. A disciplined handler standing beside a controlled K9 and a group of men who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. She said very little. She didn't need to. Her credentials spoke through the animal at her side, through the flawless execution of commands, through the calm professionalism she never lost. The truth was out now, irreversible and humiliating in its clarity. The moment they discovered who she really was, the power dynamic shattered completely. What was meant to be her breaking point became their exposure. And from that instant forward, nothing in that unit would ever be the same again. The shift from shock to accountability was swift and unavoidable. What had started as a cruel spectacle now demanded answers, and the air around the K9 unit grew tight with tension as authority asserted itself. Orders were issued. Statements were taken. The laughter that once echoed through the compound was replaced by clipped, formal voices and the unmistakable weight of scrutiny. The men who had orchestrated the test found themselves unable to explain their actions without exposing the truth, that this had never been training, never discipline, but a reckless abuse of power disguised as tradition. An internal review was launched immediately. Witnesses were separated, timelines were reconstructed, surveillance footage was pulled. The story unraveled fast, and it didn't favor those who thought they were untouchable. What stood out most wasn't just the act of throwing her into the pen, it was the planning, the coordination, the deliberate choice to ignore safety protocols and human dignity alike. Each detail painted a clearer picture of intent, and intent carried consequences. She was asked to give her account. She did so calmly, fact by fact, without embellishment or accusation. Her professionalism only sharpened the contrast. While others stumbled over excuses and contradictions, she spoke with clarity, describing commands issued, signals observed, and the exact moment the situation could have turned fatal. Her expertise reframed the incident not as a prank gone wrong, but as a near catastrophe narrowly avoided by training and restraint. As the investigation deepened, the culture that enabled the behavior came under examination. Hazing practices that had been tolerated for years were suddenly exposed to daylight. The unit's leadership faced hard questions about oversight, accountability, and the dangerous myths they had allowed to persist. The K9 program, in particular, drew focused attention. Handler rotations, animal welfare, and protocol adherence were all scrutinized, and changes were ordered without delay. For the men responsible, consequences arrived in measured steps: removals from duty, formal reprimands, suspensions pending further review. Careers that had been built on reputation alone began to wobble under documented misconduct. The realization set in slowly but decisively: this wasn't going to be buried. The evidence was too clear, the risk too great, the truth too public. Through it all, she remained steady. She didn't gloat, she didn't demand punishment. Her focus stayed where it always had: on safety, on the dog's well-being, on restoring order where chaos had been forced. In doing so, she set the tone for what followed. Justice wasn't loud, it wasn't vengeful, it was precise. And as the machinery of accountability turned, one thing became certain: the incident that was meant to silence her had instead forced a reckoning, one that would echo far beyond the walls of that compound. What happened in that K9 pen was meant to be a lesson, but not the one they intended. It exposed how easily power can corrupt when arrogance goes unchecked, and how quickly cruelty can disguise itself as tradition. The men believed fear would break her, that humiliation would put her in her place. Instead, their actions revealed something far more powerful. True strength doesn't need permission, and real authority doesn't shout. It stands calm when chaos expects collapse. She didn't survive that moment because she was lucky. She survived because she was prepared, because discipline, restraint, and expertise guided every second she spent inside that pen. While others relied on intimidation and numbers, she relied on knowledge and trust. The bond between her and that K9 wasn't built in a single command. It was forged over years of consistency, respect, and accountability. And in the end, that bond spoke louder than any insult ever could. This story matters because it reminds us how dangerous assumptions can be. Judging competence by appearance, quietness, or difference doesn't just lead to embarrassment, it can lead to irreversible harm. It also shows us that integrity under pressure has a way of surfacing truth. When systems fail and people abuse authority, professionalism becomes the line between disaster and survival. Here at Swifttail, we share stories like this to challenge perceptions, spark reflection, and highlight the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you see people differently, take a moment to support the channel. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to Swifttail so you don't miss future stories that reveal the extraordinary behind the ordinary. And don't forget to comment below. Tell us what stood out to you most, or how this story changed the way you think about power, respect, and judgment. Because the most important lessons rarely come from those who shout the loudest. They come from those who stay calm when everything is designed to break them, and let the truth speak for itself. In the days that followed, the compound felt different, quieter, tighter, as if every wall had learned how close it had come to witnessing something irreversible. Conversations were guarded now. Laughter, once careless and loud, faded into low murmurs. The incident in the K9 pen had become more than a disciplinary matter. It was a mirror held up to the culture itself. And what it reflected was not flattering. Leadership moved quickly, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Reports were filed up the chain of command, and external oversight was brought in to ensure the investigation remained impartial. The language shifted from incident to violation, from mistake to endangerment. The reality was unavoidable. This was not hazing gone too far. It was a breach of protocol that could have resulted in a handler's death and the destruction of a military working dog. That distinction mattered, and it carried weight. Policy reviews followed. Hazing practices that had survived on silence and intimidation were formally dismantled. New safeguards were introduced, including mandatory supervision during recruit integration, stricter enforcement of K9 handling rules, and psychological evaluations focused on group behavior and abuse of authority. The message was clear. Tradition was no longer an excuse. Safety and professionalism were non-negotiable. The K9 program itself underwent reform. Handler transitions were restructured to minimize stress on the animals, ensuring continuity of care and clearer accountability. Welfare checks became routine rather than optional. Training protocols were updated to emphasize that a military working dog was not a tool for intimidation, but a partner whose stability depended entirely on responsible leadership. The pen that had once symbolized fear was redefined as a place of discipline and trust. For those who had stood by and said nothing, the aftermath brought a different kind of reckoning. Some came forward with statements they had been afraid to give before. Others carried the weight of knowing that silence had nearly cost a life. The culture of looking away was no longer sustainable. What happened had made that painfully obvious. Through all of it, she continued her work with quiet focus. No interviews, no demands for recognition. Her concern remained fixed on the things that mattered, her duties, her K9, and the standards that should have existed all along. Justice, in this case, wasn't loud or dramatic. It was structural. It changed the rules so that what happened to her could not happen again. And in that sense, the aftermath did more than punish wrongdoing. It forced transformation. The pen that once represented cruelty became a turning point, marking the moment when unchecked power met accountability and when silence finally gave way to reform. As the dust settled and reforms took shape, attention slowly turned toward her, not as a target this time, but as a symbol. There were questions about whether she would make a formal statement beyond what protocol required, whether she would speak publicly about what happened, whether she would allow her story to be framed by others. In a world eager for outrage and spectacle, many expected anger, demands, or at least a clear condemnation of those who had wronged her. What they received instead was restraint. She understood the weight of words and the permanence of records. Speaking out could have brought attention, even praise, but it also risked shifting focus away from the real issue. This wasn't about her pride or her pain, it was about preventing future harm. She had seen what public outrage could do. It could harden defenses, turn accountability into hostility, and reduce complex failures into simple villains. She wanted none of that. Her goal was correction, not escalation. In official settings, she spoke when necessary and stayed factual. She answered questions with precision, outlining what happened, why it was dangerous, and how it could be avoided in the future. She never exaggerated. She never speculated. Her words carried weight because they were measured, not emotional. Leadership noticed. So did those quietly watching, learning what professionalism looked like under pressure. Privately, her response was no less intentional. She focused on rebuilding trust within the unit, not by forcing forgiveness, but by modeling standards. She showed up early. She trained hard. She treated everyone, even those who had failed her, with consistent professionalism. That choice unsettled people more than anger ever could. It removed excuses. It forced reflection. Some asked why she didn't demand harsher punishment. Others wondered how she could remain composed after being placed in mortal danger. The answer was simple, though rarely understood. She knew who she was. Her identity had never depended on their approval or their cruelty. She didn't need to prove strength through retaliation. She had already demonstrated it where it mattered most. By choosing restraint, she shaped the narrative in a way no speech ever could. The story became less about revenge and more about responsibility, less about humiliation and more about growth. In refusing to center herself as a victim, she redirected attention toward the systems that needed change and ensured that those changes had a chance to last. Sometimes, the most powerful statement is not made in words. It is made in conduct, amid investigations, policy changes, and quiet conversations behind closed doors. One presence remained constant, the dog. While people debated responsibility and reform, the animal returned to routine with remarkable steadiness, a reminder of what discipline and trust truly looked like in practice. For her, the dog was never a symbol or a tool in a larger narrative. It was a partner. And that distinction mattered more than anyone outside the K9 world could fully understand. The bond between a handler and a military working dog is built slowly, through repetition and respect. Every command is reinforced by consistency. Every correction is balanced with care. Over time, the dog learns not just what to do, but who to trust when confusion or danger arises. That trust had been tested brutally in the pen, yet it hadn't broken. The dog's hesitation, its pause before acting, wasn't weakness, it was recognition. It was training, doing exactly what it was meant to do. Observers often focused on the moment the dog sat, as if obedience alone explained everything. But those who understood K9 behavior knew the truth ran deeper. The dog didn't simply obey a command, it recalibrated its entire state. Aggression gave way to focus. Instinct yielded to relationship. That shift doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a handler has spent countless hours proving, again and again, that their direction leads to safety. The incident also forced many to confront uncomfortable realities about how animals were viewed within the system. The dog had been treated as a threat to scare a human, not as a partner whose welfare and stability mattered. That misuse was as dangerous to the animal as it was to her. In recognizing this, reforms began to address not just human conduct, but animal care, acknowledging that a stressed, confused dog was not a weapon to be wielded, but a responsibility to be protected. For the dog, life returned to structure, feeding schedules restored, training sessions normalized, handler presence consistent once again. That stability mattered. It reaffirmed what the pen incident had threatened to unravel. And through it all, the dog remained attentive, disciplined, and loyal, not because of fear, but because trust had been repaired where it briefly risked being broken. In many ways, the dog embodied the core lesson of the entire story. Power without understanding creates chaos. Authority without responsibility leads to harm, but leadership rooted in trust, whether with people or animals, creates control, even in the most volatile moments. At the center of it all was not just a woman who refused to be broken, but a dog that proved exactly why respect, consistency, and care are the foundation of real strength. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. What you see on the surface is rarely the full truth. The woman thrown into that K9 pen was judged before she was known, underestimated before she was understood, and nearly destroyed by assumptions that had nothing to do with her ability. And yet, when the moment demanded it, her discipline, restraint, and expertise spoke louder than fear ever could. Her experience challenges all of us to think more carefully about how quickly we judge others, especially in environments where power and hierarchy blur the line between authority and abuse. Every day in workplaces, institutions, and even casual social settings, people are labeled without context. Quiet becomes weak, different becomes dangerous, new becomes disposable. This story is a reminder of how harmful those assumptions can be, not just emotionally, but physically. It asks us to consider how often cruelty hides behind tradition, how often silence is mistaken for submission, and how often real competence goes unnoticed simply because it doesn't demand attention. Here at Swifttail, stories like this aren't told just to shock or entertain. They're shared to spark reflection, empathy, and awareness. They remind us that respect should never be conditional, and that true leadership is revealed not by how much power someone claims, but by how responsibly they use it. The strongest people in the room are often the ones who don't need to prove it. As you reflect on what you've heard, think about the spaces you move through and the roles you play within them. Ask yourself how you treat those who are new, quiet, or different. Ask yourself whether you challenge cruelty when you see it or look away. Change doesn't always start with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with choosing understanding over judgment and professionalism over ego. Because as this story shows, the consequences of arrogance can be severe, but the impact of quiet strength can be lasting. And when respect replaces assumption, everyone is safer for it. Long after the paperwork was filed and routines returned to normal, the impact of what happened lingered in quieter ways. The story became one people referenced in training rooms and private conversations, not as gossip, but as a cautionary reminder. It reshaped how newcomers were treated, how authority was exercised, and how quickly arrogance could unravel under real scrutiny. The incident wasn't remembered for the cruelty itself, but for the moment it failed, when calm professionalism exposed recklessness and forced a long-overdue reckoning. Her legacy was never about public recognition or personal victory. It lived in the changes that followed, in the subtle but meaningful shifts in behavior and standards. Recruits noticed that instructions were clearer, supervision more present, and boundaries more firmly enforced. The K9 unit, once spoken of with fear, came to be understood with respect. The message was simple and enduring: competence deserves recognition, and power demands responsibility. For those who witnessed it firsthand, the memory carried weight. They had seen how quickly things could have gone wrong, and how close they came to irreversible consequences. That awareness stayed with them. It changed how they measured strength, how they defined leadership, and how they treated those who didn't fit familiar molds. Quiet confidence no longer went unnoticed. Silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. In the end, the most powerful outcome wasn't punishment or reform alone, it was perspective. A single moment revealed how dignity under pressure can outlast intimidation, and how true authority is earned through knowledge, restraint, and respect. The pen that was meant to destroy her became a turning point, not just for a unit, but for the values it chose to uphold moving forward. And that is the lasting lesson of this story. When integrity meets adversity, it doesn't just survive, it reshapes the space around it. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly for the moment it's needed most and changes everything when it finally steps forward.